Today on In Good Faith, I'm pleased to be speaking with Reverend Dr. David Latimore, who's the director of the Betsey Stockton Center for Black Church Studies at the Princeton Theological Seminary. That's where he's speaking to me from. Reverend Latimore, thank you so much for making time today.
I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation to engage in this conversation.
Just as background for listeners, Reverend Latimore's teaching and research interests focus on the intersection of religion, race, and economic justice. And before he was at Princeton, he was senior pastor at the 15th Avenue Baptist Church in Nashville, associate director for the Academy of Preachers, and has pastored 3 other congregations in Illinois, Florida, and Missouri. I also should mention that your wife is completing a master's as well in ministry, and also in marriage, as she daily reminds me. And together they are the parents of 5.
4 girls and 1 boy, and the youngest of which is graduating on Saturday. So
congratulations!
Thank you so much.
So, Reverend, you're the director of the Betsey Stockton Center there at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Tell us just a bit about who she was and why that is so important.
Well, thank you. Again, delighted to be here. The Betsey Stockton Center here at Princeton Theological Seminary has evolved out of a confluence of events and catalysts. Chief among them was the seminary's slavery audit. In 2016, 2017, it engaged in an examination, like many or a handful of higher education institutions did something similar, looking at its history and seeing where were the intersections between the history of the institution and the institution of slavery, and unpacking that and determining what effect, impact, or influence that might have for its current operations. And the seminary recognized, while it did not benefit directly from enslaved persons building or working at the seminary, there were lots of members of the faculty, both of the seminary as well as the university, who benefited from enslaved labor. And one of those individuals was a young woman by the name of Betsy, and I say Betsey Stockton, but she assumed the name of the individuals who held onto her as a possession. But Betsy was instrumental both in that home and in a number of ways. And so the seminary decided, in honoring, in acknowledging and confessing its history, to establish a center and to name that center after this great woman, in an effort to create an aspirational aspect of what the center desired or hoped to be. The center focuses on issues related to the African American church, African American religious experience, and the communities to which those churches serve. So we try to engage in the broad and robust discussion of what are those issues that are at the forefront of African American clergy, African American congregations, and African American communities, and to find solutions and answers and to explore the richness of the past and the possibilities of the future for these particular churches.
And I understand you're actually working on it. You come from a business background, and we'll get into this, your shift from that into theology and ministry, but you're working on a book about the economic history of the Black church with this question: has it been more influenced by economics or theology? So tell me why you delved into that and why that was an important question.
Well, like many foci of academic engagement, they emerge or birth out of the experience of the researcher. And so in my case, I spent the first 15 years of my career in investment management, and so was deeply steeped into economic thought, finance, and all of the permutations of that particular industry, and later made the transition to more direct and robust engagement in the life of the church. But one of the questions that I had shortly after first assuming full-time service to the church was the ways in which my economic training seemed to be so impactful on my understanding of my role within the church, or the identity of the church, or the practices of the church, or the criteria that I might use to determine whether the church was successful or not. And oftentimes, ideas that were born out of the economic sphere were present in my thinking without my acknowledgement. As an example, I'm new to the church. I pastored a church in Joliet, Illinois, for a number of years, a wonderful congregation and a wonderful place to grow as a pastor. But when I arrived there, I probably asked a question that is not unfamiliar to many men and women who serve as in pastoral roles, and that is, so what will success look like? And immediately, I said, well, we grow the congregation and we grow the tithes and offering, which was the primary source of funding for the church. Both great ideas and both appropriate, but I did so without any question as to what is it that my understanding of God means for either of those criteria. Is it always the case that God simply wants us to grow the church that we're at? Or might God look at growth in different ways? Is the growth of the revenue stream the singular and penultimate determination of success? Or does my theology require me to look at these measures differently? So in lots of places, I thought about how do we market the church and we get new members in. And so much of my thinking was really reflective of a business model. Again, nothing inherently wrong with a business model, but a business model requires theological interrogation, and that's what was missing. And the longer I was a pastor and the more I pursued my own academic development, I began to realize that oftentimes unaware or unacknowledged by the leader, there are ideas that are operative in their thinking that have not been thoroughly engaged theologically. And my hope was to begin to pull at that. And so the work that I'm doing around the economic history of the Black church is first to simply tell the story. To what degree have economic phenomenon throughout the years influenced the identity and the praxis of all churches, but particularly the African American church, because our history is so replete with examples of economic deprivation that often renders us more susceptible to the pursuit of economic progress. And again, nothing inherently wrong with that. But to what degree might it lead us down paths that can be rightly challenged by the underlying theology that we espouse as believers? You know, it really comes from my own questioning and wrestling, and I think is more prominent than sometimes we give credit to.
So every church has some really temporal practicalities to deal with. The parking lot needs redoing. The roof needs redoing. We've got to keep the lights on and the heat or the cooling. So there is no way not to have to deal with those things. So have you come up with a way to measure like this, how you can be sure you're leaning to the spiritual side of that equation and not so overburdened by the economic aspects?
Absolutely. So there's no question, as you rightly say, that we are all bombarded both at the individual and at the institutional level with real material concerns. And ignoring material existence is itself its own danger. So within the African American church, we have the language around a this worldly perspective versus an otherworldly perspective. The this worldly is singularly or myopically focused on the concerns of the material existence, and the otherworldly is the perception that all our answers will come to us in the sweet by and by, and when I get to the other side, and that has its own challenges. So no question that we've got to deal with both eternal and temporal, both material and spiritual. But I think that at our best, our theology helps us to respond to these issues as individuals and also as the church. We are each required to both be responsive to material needs that we face, but to not surrender our higher ideas to simply material existence. We're called to think of others. We're called to prioritize some of the fundamental principles of our faith and to allow them to influence our decisions even as they relate to our own lives. Well, if that's what we ask of disciples, certainly the institution should also be similarly directed. That the goal of the church is not its own sustainability, but quite frankly, it is its service, even if that service might lead it down paths that challenge its sustainability. Notice many of the concerns, the parking lot, the infrastructure, things that I faced all the time as a pastor. Oftentimes when those decisions come up, the decisions are quickly made. We got to have heat. We got to have air. We want people to be able to come and to attend our church. So let's expand the parking lot. Reasonable expectations of a church, but do they represent our highest priorities? Should I always pick place over people? Should I divert resources from the care of others to simply expand the parking lot? Why is it that I privilege investment in infrastructure over investment in people? And so I'm not suggesting at all that there's anything wrong with that kind of careful deliberation. But what I hope that churches will do is always wrestle with these questions and not simply privilege the infrastructure or the material over the people that we're called to care for or the community in which we operate, because those concerns can take over. And then our focus is really simply on institutional sustainability, not institutional mission as born out of our faith.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of both scripture and activism. I think it was Gandhi who said there are some people so hungry the only way God can speak to them is through bread. Meaning you can't really be concerned with the Spirit if you are so desperate just to preserve your own life.
Absolutely.
And of course, Jesus talks about when I was hungry and you came to me, or naked and you clothed me. So how is economic justice tied to people's spiritual lives?
Well, I think you've rightly quoted Gandhi and really spoken to the core issue. So within economics, as an example, we see a phenomenon or a pull toward being asocial. And by asocial, simply meaning that we privilege the focus on the individual over community. Quite frankly, in much of economic theory, there's the thought that we are intelligent consumers. We understand what baskets of good give us the highest satisfaction. And oftentimes we prioritize individual satisfaction over any communal investment, except where the communal investment works to the benefit of the individual. The gospel that we pursue is very different. It thinks of communal first and foremost. What can I do for others? And so it's out of the essence of what within the Christian and particularly, on the day that we selected a new pope, it is true across faith. So Protestant, Catholicism, our brothers and sisters in the Latter-day Saints, and any of the other traditions that exist, we often elevate our investment in the community over and above ourselves, with the belief that we serve a God that if one pursues that God will also care for the individuals. Do the birds give any thought to what they'll wear or the food that's available to them? No, because there is the underlying belief that God will take care of us. Again, there's agency by the individual. So it doesn't mean that we simply sit on the street corner and wait for God to drop off the next potted roast for dinner. But it does say that I don't have to be consumed, even though the culture around me is constantly telling me I should be consumed with individual existence and sustainability, that there is a belief that God will care for you. And so what does that look like when we come together in these communities of church? How do we demonstrate a faith beyond our own agency and a commitment to the care of others? So economic justice requires me to look at the broader context and say, can I be successful? Can I be satisfied if the men and women who walk by my church every Sunday or Monday through Friday are going without while I enjoy so much? And it raises those questions of where does our faith really live in relationship to the men and women that we're blessed to come in contact with, but who may be disadvantaged within our economic system.
How does, or does this even tie in with this phrase that I hear about the prosperity gospel?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the challenges within the African American community because of the history of socioeconomic deprivation. And for reasons far more expansive than I can articulate, there has been a real responsiveness to this idea that our faithful service to God will result in our material prosperity. And there is, as it is in most ideas, there is certainly a substance of truth there. I do serve a God that will provide. I serve a God that can and often does answer our needs. I don't want to abandon that notion that God is interested in our material existence and that God is working for our experiences of equality in our material existence. I believe that. What I want to suggest, though, and this is where I think prosperity gospel falls short, is the notion that God cannot prosper us even if our material existence suffers. So that prosperity, as we understand it in the broader context of our faith, is not simply defined or tied to material existence, but that we believe we have a God that, though I make my bed in hell, God is there. Though I suffer, God is there. So there's ways of understanding God's providential presence that's not tied to my material existence. It does not mean that God is unconcerned when material conditions are working in disadvantageous ways to human existence. But it simply means that I cannot define the God that I serve or the gospel that I believe in and measure its impact simply by how well I'm doing. And for me, that's not just theology. That's been my own journey. As I mentioned, I started out in investment management. I was born in the city of St. Louis. St. Louis was a highly segregated city. I remember, I've told this many times, I probably was 10 or 11 before I realized America wasn't all black. Everybody in my neighborhood was black. Everybody in my school was black. Everybody at the grocery store was black. I only saw non-black folk on TV. So imagine my chagrin being disabused of that notion. And I also grew up in a relatively impoverished community. I did not realize that I was impoverished until I got to college because I had what everyone else had. And so it wasn't until I got to college and was in a much more economically diverse community that I realized, okay, I was in a sociology class. We were reading a book, Behind Ghetto Walls, which was a book written about the Pruitt-Igoe projects, which was the first kind of mixed race housing development in America. That's where I was born and grew up in. And it was I can't even describe the feeling of seeing the place that you grew up in described in such stark and economically deprived ways, but that was the reality. Anyway, because of that background, when I went to college, my thought was, well, I've been poor once. Let me not repeat that. Let me go out and pursue prosperity. And I started in management consulting, moved to investment management, and experienced the material success that comes with that. But at a certain point, I started to serve bivocationally as a pastor in a small church in St. Louis. I quickly realized that to be smart is not the same as being a good pastor, and that I needed additional training, and had a conversation with my wife, and we made the decision that we were going to step away from the investment management arena, and that we were going to pursue theological training. Because she believed that I had a use beyond just being investment management. And we sold the land and cars. We packed up our houses and we wound up going to Duke in Durham because I could afford to live there based on our savings. And it proved to be the best decision that I've ever made for both me and my family. And of the many lessons that I learned, one of them was that the strength of our family was not tied to the vacations we took, the places that we lived, the material consequences of our life. There was something deeper and richer that we discovered even though we no longer had access to some of the same things. And that's not to mean that we didn't notice the difference in access, or that having those things were necessarily inherently bad, but we learned some things about our God and ourselves when they were no longer accessible, that have enriched our lives in profound ways. So I would, and I'm not suggesting that's the only way to experience God. God comes to us in lots of different ways. That just happened to be the way that I came into a deeper understanding of how profoundly wonderful God is, even when our material existence changes. God is not tied to that.
I wonder if you'd walk us back for just a little bit to the home you grew up in and the role that faith played there.
I can. So both my parents are deceased, but their presence and their spirit lives with me. So I often hear my mom and dad's voice echoing in the background, and I could hear them now saying, "You better make sure you tell them how good God has been throughout your lifetime." I grew up in a very religious home. My parents were not formally educated. Both of them had some elementary school experience, but hadn't gotten much past that. But they were, both them and the extended family were deeply steeped in their faith. I attended what we now would refer to as a small sanctified church in St. Louis, and spent most of my week at some service at church. So they're all day on Sundays, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Maybe you get Friday night off and you're back at rehearsals on Saturday. And one of the other elements of that experience was it was a church that believed profoundly in you knowing Scripture for yourself. So I grew up with Bible quizzes and learning large passages of Scripture, and that being such a intuitive and constitutive part of my life. And it proved to be of tremendous value. Now there were some shortcomings. My wife is from New Orleans. She is so. I mean, her musical acumen is profoundly greater than my own. I tell all the time I didn't start listening to secular music till I was well in high school, because our radio station stayed on gospel music 24/7. We, and so she and it's one of the blessings of her presence in my life. She has a very different cultural upbringing. But mine, until I was probably in high school, was limited specifically to church. And I saw the ways in which that wind up being somewhat problematic for many of the people I grew up with, because by the time they got on their own, they were encountering circumstances for the first time that they didn't always have the skills to engage and unravel because they only had the church experience. But I also have received and understood the good of that, because by the time I was on my own, when I went to college, like most students, I exercised a greater liberty in the activities that I was engaged in, but there was always a constraint. I could only go so far, and there was something about the way in which I had encountered God in my youth that held me firm and said, okay, well, maybe you don't go to church as regularly as you used to, but you're not comfortable trying this or doing this. And so I'm incredibly grateful for that upbringing and the knowledge of the word, which obviously as I became a pastor became invaluable as a part of my life.
You talked about the way you had encountered God as a young person. And how would you describe that? Was it just a sense of presence or a strong belief? What was that for you?
Well, for me, my understanding of God's presence in my life is really retrospective. And I am amazed at how much God's presence in my life reminds me of my presence in my children's life. If you had children, you've had this experience where they have come and with excitement shared something that someone has said to them. And I've sat back in those moments and thought, I've been saying that to you for the last decade, but it took an outside voice for it suddenly to be truth. What it means in my children's life is that sometimes my role has been to simply plant seeds that someone else comes and waters. And if I had not planted it, then maybe it wouldn't have been received even at that later date in the same way. Well, I see the same thing in the way that God has been present. I can look back at multiple times through my life where God has been operative and present, but I didn't always recognize it. And it wasn't until later that when I looked through a different lens, I could see the way that God operated. I like most of the young folk in my church and my surrounding, when I was approaching graduation, I was planning on enrolling in the Marine Corps because everyone went to the service as a way of progressing through life. It was just through happenstance that a woman who worked with my mom was a typist at the government center in St. Louis. She was, as mothers often do, bragging about my academic performance and my son has done so well, etc. The woman recommended, well, you should have him take the ACTs and SATs. I wasn't planning on doing that, but something about her presence really influenced my mom to say, you ought to at least try it. And having taken the exams and having done well, she then also encouraged, well, why don't you consider college as well? Had never been on my radar screen. Again, my parents didn't go to college. I was the oldest. Many of the folks in my church hadn't gone. But it was because of that woman's presence there that it planted the seed. Well, I might not have realized it then, but I can look back and say, God was operative in opening up doors and introducing conversations and guiding us. It still required action on my part. It still required me to do my part. But I can't ignore the fact that God was always there. God was always there providing, even though that provision might seem insufficient to the outside worlds. Again, as I grew up, it was more than sufficient for us. So I can look back on my life and I can identify God's careful presence, influencing, planting in my life, developing things that have richly blessed me much later on. And so I celebrate that again as enthusiastically as my children coming back to me with what they say is now new learning.
Been there, done that. Yes. And all I can do is be grateful to the person who said the thing.
That's right.
For saying it and reinforcing.
That's right. That's
so
right.
I'm wondering if because you can look back, you said retrospectively, sort of in the rear view mirror, you see the hand of God. Did that prepare you for when you felt this actual change to leave your profession and to go into ministry and study mission? Did you feel like that was a call, or you somehow felt that God had opened that door? How did you think of that?
Yeah, I certainly believe that it was a call. And I think that this is generally true, but it certainly was in my case. Our ability to hear from God is often sharpened in moments where it requires sacrifice. You know, it is in the moments where there's something at stake that I think can often increase the acuity of our spiritual listening to the voice of God. I was keenly aware that my decision to go to seminary and to pastor was not out of some Jobian sense that if I make this sacrifice now, God will return it sevenfold over, or that I would even return to the level of material success that I had been enjoying. But I very much felt the call on my life with God saying, listen, you have obeyed me and I have blessed you. Now, what are you willing to sacrifice to serve? That question echoed in my heart, in part because of my time as a bivocational pastor and me seeing the great need for ministries that impacted lives and the great blessing that I received having pastored that small congregation. It came from my realization that the material success can't be the end all and be all. that life has to be richer than this. And because of the way I was raised, when I close my eyes in this life and I stand before the Lord, what am I going to celebrate, or what's going to be worthy of the gifts that God has and the opportunity that God has given me? I was keenly aware of the sacrifice. I realized the decision I was making was going to have a generational effect because my kids wouldn't have the same access to things because our material conditions were changing. I couldn't take them on some of the fancy trips or do some of the things that I thought might be beneficial to them. We knew that our kids wouldn't be able to continue going to private schools, wouldn't have the same access. But I believed that God was still going to provide for us and make a way. All of my kids wind up being students in public schools, and they've been to Northwestern and Dartmouth and Georgetown and WashU. I mean, they've not suffered academically, in part because of the wonderful work their mom has done, but in part because God has always been present, and God creates multiple paths toward our experiences of abundance. So I think that our trust in God was not guaranteed. There were lots of doubts along the way, questions that we raised, but ultimately we decided we were going to bet on God and not our own ability. And that in part was the result of the upbringing that I had. It was in part the result of the help that I had through my wife and family. And it was in part the result of just God's grace and surrounding us with folk that provided a good influence for us.
Well, those are brave steps, especially when you've got little mouths to feed and growing bodies that every 6 months seem to not fit the clothes that you got them.
Mercy. That's right. That's right. In the middle of our kids, my son is smack dab in the midst of the 4 girls. So even though we got away with hand-me-downs for the first 2, we had to start all over with the son. And so, I mean, yeah. So so it causes me to be very sensitive to material challenge. It also, as a member of the African American religious community, I'm keenly aware of the economic disparities that exist. And so certainly never want to lose sight of the ways in which our faith informs our responses to those challenges. But my personal journey has also given me absolute confidence that I serve a God that will provide what we need. May not do it in accordance with the world, but will give us the kind of response to material challenges that we can be blessed by, find peace in, be nurtured by, and live lives that can be meaningful.
How did you see that play out as a pastor? I'm putting you totally on the spot here, but can you think of an example or two about the kind of thing or specific stories or people where that was the challenge, and how was it going to be dealt with?
Well, I've seen it in a couple of ways. I have witnessed God be present in moments where the outcome was not what we desired. And I'm thinking specifically in times that I've been visiting people in hospice, people who are in stage 4 cancer, people who have been overtaken by sudden physical trauma, and where the outcome was not restoration. It wasn't deliverance. The outcome was the ability to come to a place of peace, to recognize the richness of the journey that they had been on, to find joy in the responses of family and loved ones who were articulating the ways in which their presence had made the difference in their life. So many of those pastoral visits, particularly in times of trauma, have shown me the ways in which God remains present both in sunshine and rain. I have witnessed God for men and women who were suffering through addiction to provide them with the internal resource to be able to respond to that addiction and lead wholesome and healthy lives, even as they daily wrestled with the temptations of that limitation. I've seen God provide put food on folks' tables when they didn't have the resources. And God often worked through the community and worked through agencies, but ultimately it was the providential presence of God that allowed that family to sustain themselves and to watch people move from places of deprivation to places of sustainability and abundance, both through their own hard work and going. And I remember a young man who wound up being serving as a wonderful janitor at our church, but who we came in contact with much earlier in this journey. And there were lots of things that he had to work his way through, but he demonstrated the kind of faithful persistence that God was able to reward. He used the church to provide a job opportunity. He opened up some other doors for the young man. I watched him find a partner, build a family. And these are all things that no one, when he came to us, would have ever envisioned his life having as elements of his existence. So I've watched God meet individuals in a variety of circumstances that if you were making a prognosis when you met them, you would have never envisioned where their life was going to end up. And I want to emphasize, in a lot of those cases, it was the agency of the individual. But the agency of the individual does not provide the full explanation. It was also God intervening through individuals, through community agencies, through circumstances to enrich their lives in a very powerful way. And they live as testimonies. And I've obviously witnessed the same in my own life. We've had financial struggles. We've met times of challenge. And in every moment, God has been present. When I was in seminary, there were a couple of times when things got very challenging financially. What you think might last you 3 years of a seminary journey at the beginning, you quickly find out it won't. My wife has always been a wonderful seamstress. And so she just decided to try her hand at doing curtains. And through a series of events, wind up securing a handful of folk who hired her professionally to do the drapes for their homes. They didn't know it, but those resources came in absolutely critical times for our family. And for me, I think it's both the beauty of my wife's talent, her willingness to work at it, but it was also God's desire and God's effort to be present and provide opportunities for us. So again, in ways big and small, I see too many places where God has been present, and I celebrate that, while I also celebrate the agency of everyone that I've witnessed these testimonies emerge from.
One last question, just about studying theology, because that can be a pursuit of knowledge, and that's not necessarily wisdom always. But in what ways do you see theological students how does that draw them closer, or how could it and can it draw them closer to God?
It certainly can draw them closer to God, but it does not automatically do so. The challenge with theological study is that it is a reflection of our privileging of the rational aspects of our existence. We tend to, we're children of the Enlightenment. So we believe in scientific method and providing rational explanations even for our theological commitments. And again, I celebrate that, the life of the mind. But for many students, what that then causes is when they arrive at seminary, they're getting introduced to ideas and thoughts that reflect the breadth and the richness of the Christian story. But it often challenges their perspectives that are formed by their own experiences. Most of us think the way we were raised is what's normative. And so when those normative standards get changed or challenged, it can be unnerving. And secondly, because oftentimes the experiences that have formed our early faith defy our ability to always respond rationally. We often say, hey, I don't know why I believe this, but this is the faith of my mom and my grandmother. And so it has provided me some strength. So you got both dynamics occurring, the inability to always respond within the context of a rational argument. And then secondly, the encounters with elements that challenge you. I think if a student allows themselves the space, what's beautiful about theological education is, one, it introduces you to the idea that certitude is not the destination. Quite frankly, the more I learn about God, the more comfortable I begin to become with what I don't know about God. I begin to recognize that God is so much greater than my experiences or even what I'm learning, that I begin to grow comfortable with the realization that there are going to be things that I'm going to encounter and that I can't make sense of. The old theodicy questions of, if God's all powerful and if there is evil, why didn't God just get rid of the evil? Or great questions and worthy of intellectual engagement, as long as I hold on to the reality that I may not be able to unravel this. The explanations I have can always be challenged. So one is just growing comfortable with the issues of uncertainty. Secondly, recognizing that not everything that your grandmother left you is good or bad. So the willingness to hold to your faith lightly, to recognize that the faith that you formed before coming to seminary is not something to simply be abandoned. This is hard-earned faith. So you ought not just give it up easily, but you're going to encounter some better ideas. You're going to encounter better theory around atonement. You're going to come into some contact with some models around Christology that you just had not considered. And so when you come in contact with better ideas, be willing to embrace them. But in places where the academic argument is presented to you, does not mean you have to accept that. There will be some places where you will say, you know what, I don't know that I can make the argument, but for the time being, I'm going to stick with what my grandmother gave me. I'm going to believe in the power of prayer. I'm going to believe in the goodness of service, if that is not reflected even in the theology that one might come in contact with. So I think it is that this is a place of growing, and it is not a place of final answers. It is a place where we equip people with the tools to engage in important issues, but we trust that you do this engagement in conversation with God, so that God is never absent from the deliberative process. And sometimes God will speak to you in ways beyond the deliberative process. He'll speak to you through the grandmother in the church or through the circumstance that you've encountered. So both have to go hand in hand, and each interrogates the other to lead us to what hopefully are more profoundly impactful decisions and understandings.
Thank you. Reverend Dr. David Latimore, a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for making time.
I appreciate it. Delight to have this conversation with you. It's been a blessing to me just to revisit some of these questions as well.